What's up everybody, welcome to another HOI4 modding lesson on the Iron Workshop. In this lesson we'll be learning how to create custom diplomatic actions. A very cool modding feature added to HOI4 in one of its DLCs, I don't really remember which one, which allows us to create custom diplomatic actions that we can do towards other countries in HOI4. Now this is a bit of a complicated thing to mod, so to make things easier, what I've done is I've created some of the initial or basic files that you need to create these diplomatic actions, and I've uploaded this file or this mod to Steam. So what you need to do in order to continue this lesson, you'll need to go to the link that is in the description of this video, download the mod, the DATF mod, which stands for Diplomatic Action Template File. And once you have access to that file and to that mod, we can start with the lesson. So I'll give you a few minutes to get everything set up. We'll roll the intro and see you right back. Alright, so I assume that by now you've downloaded the DATF mod and all of its files, and we can get to work. Now, before we actually start messing around with the code, there is one thing that I should explain about creating these diplomatic actions, and that thing is scoping. Now, if you haven't watched my basic syntax video, scoping is a function in the game when the game searches for a target for something, right? In this example, for a diplomatic action, right? So we're scoping, we're looking for a target. And the thing is that in diplomatic actions, unlike events or decisions or even focuses, the default scoping is your target country. It is not the country that's executing the diplomatic action, and it is very important that you understand this before you start creating these diplomatic actions. Me personally, it confused me quite a lot at the start until I got it down. So let me just say it as simple as I can. When you create diplomatic actions, your target, your default target, is the country that diplomatic action is being done towards, not your own country that you're currently playing in the game. All right, this is very important. And now that we understand this, we can move on to understanding the structure of the diplomatic action file. All right, so after you downloaded the DATF mod, in the location that I specified on the Steam page, you will find this folder called IW Request. And inside that folder, you'll have all of these folders. This is something that we usually do with the creating files and folders structure in each video. But this time, because things are a little bit more complex, I decided that we can skip this part because you'll be using my template files anyway, so there's no point in just recreating this thing from zero. All right, so in this folder, I want you to go to Common, Scripted Diplomatic Actions, and open the IW Test Diplo Request. Now your file may look a bit different, and that is because it contains a lot of comments that I've put so that you can more easily understand how to structure your file and what each thing does. But I will still be going over this file and explaining the various aspects so that we can understand how to properly use this file in the game. Now another thing that I want you to do while we're working on this file, I want you to open the game in debug mode. Because one of the coolest things about modding these diplomatic actions is that when you're in debug mode, they update automatically on the fly. So you can see the results of what you're doing right there in the game. If you don't know how to start your game in debug mode, I'll have a link to that in the description as well, and probably in the upper right corner of the screen. So you can go ahead, watch that, start your game in debug mode, and come back. So what we have here is a diplomatic action that I created, and that you will be editing to your own needs and to your own preferences. But this is the basic structure that almost all diplomatic actions have. And this is the way that I like to structure these files. If you take a closer look at the file, you'll see that at first we have the conditions, that determine when we can use or see this diplomatic action. Then we have the localization for our diplomatic action. Then we have the effects. And then we have some AI programming to determine how the AI will use this diplomatic action. So I really like to have these things in a very particular order that allows me to go from one section to another and better understand what it is that I'm changing. So each diplomatic action file starts with this line here at the top, scripted diplomatic actions. If you are creating a new file, a completely new TXT file where you want to put diplomatic actions, that file will have to begin with this line. And of course, you need to make sure to close this bracket with a closing bracket. All right. Now you don't have to actually separate your diplomatic actions into different files. You can put a couple of these in the same file as long as they are inside of this scripted diplomatic actions container. Next, we have the name or the ID of our diplomatic action. So this is a reference for the game to understand which diplomatic action we currently want to deal with. After that, we have the icon for the diplomatic action, and I will talk about that icon a little bit more later when we get to creating our icon. Next, we have a couple of conditions that determine when we can actually use or when can we see this diplomatic action. Now, some of these can be a little bit confusing because it kind of seems like they're doing the same thing. So for example, allowed and selectable and can be accepted. They can be quite confusing, but don't worry, we'll go over each one and we'll understand exactly what it does. Next, we have cost. So this is the cost to perform this diplomatic action. And usually this cost is in diplomatic power. So if I were to put 50 here, that means that when I do the diplomatic action, my country that has done the diplomatic action will have a -50 diplomatic power. Next, we have requires acceptance and show acceptance on action button. This tells the game if this diplomatic action requires acceptance. Now, in general, most diplomatic actions are split into two categories. There are the diplomatic actions that do not require acceptance. That means that the moment that you clicked and that you're done with the diplomatic action, it is executed. The other ones will require the target country to accept the diplomatic action, and only then it is being executed. And this is just a parameter to determine if you want to see the chances of the AI accepting or rejecting the diplomatic request. All right, now let's go over these conditions so that we understand properly what they do. And the best way to do that is to go into the game and see how these things are affected. So I'm going to open HOI4 with the DATF mod enabled. And as you can see here, if I click on another country, I have this diplomatic action already present in here, right? So let's see what allowed does. Allowed determines if I can actually execute this diplomatic action after this screen pops up, right? So here it determines if I can actually click or not the send button. So let's go ahead and just do a little experiment and see how it works, right? Let's say that I want to limit this action by political power. So I can just type something like has political power more than 500. And I'll save it. And you'll see now that I can click the political action here. But when I go here, it's grayed out. I can no longer send it. And that means that the game is checking whether France, because as I said before, the default scope for the diplomatic action is the target country. So it's not checking mine, the country that I'm currently playing, Germany, my political power. It is checking the political power of France. And if France does not have more than 500 political power, it will not allow me to send this diplomatic action. Excellent. So I'm going to remove it. Next, let's go to visible. So visible is actually pretty straightforward. This determines when can I see or when can't I see this diplomatic action in the diplomacy list, right? And I can limit it in the same way that I limited the allowed trigger. So let's go ahead and, for example, say has political power 500. Now again, what this will do, it will check whether France has more than 500 political power, and if it does not, it will not show me the diplomatic action in the list of actions that I can do. Now you can see that here it's still visible, but if I right click France again, it will disappear, right? Because it still needs to be updated, but obviously when you're in the game, these things don't happen since these settings are static. All right, so we can now see that the diplomatic action has disappeared. By now you might have a very reasonable question, which is, okay, it's nice that I can check the political power of the target, but what if I want to check my own political power, right? So if Germany doesn't have more than 500 political power, I don't want this thing to show, right? So in order to do that, we need to do a very small change. Just before this condition, I need to put the following: root equals open bracket and close bracket. Now root is the country that we are currently playing, okay? It is always the country that you're currently playing. So let's take a look at it now. The action is still invisible, but I do have 2 political power. So let's just go ahead and change this to 1, right? So if I, Germany, root, have more political power than 1, then I will be able to see this political action. So let's go ahead and see if it works. Excellent. And now I see it because I do have more than 1 political power. Great. Let's move along. Next, we have selectable. So what selectable does, it determines whether I can actually click this action in the list here. All right, now let's talk about can be accepted and can be sent. I'll be totally honest with you. I haven't really used these 2 settings ever. I mostly just leave them blank like this because I have selectable and I have allowed, and I mostly use these. I don't really know if you really have any use for these, but obviously they can allow you to have another limiter of when a country can accept or send a diplomatic action. So use it at your own discretion, play around with it, see how it works, and maybe you'll find use for it. It's there for you if you want it. Next up, I want to talk about the effects. We will be talking about localization separately later on when we take care of localizing our diplomatic action. So let's see what we have here in effects. So we have on-sent effect and complete effect. Now, obviously, this can be a little bit confusing. What is exactly the difference between these 2? So on-sent effect is an effect which is executed when you send the diplomatic action. Complete effect is executed when the diplomatic action is completed. Still confused? That's totally okay. I was totally confused as well when I started working with this, but let's go ahead and take a deeper look into it and see exactly what it means. Before I said that we have 2 main types of diplomatic actions. We have diplomatic actions that require acceptance, and we have the diplomatic actions that do not require acceptance. The difference between these is the execution. So diplomatic actions that do not require acceptance are executed or completed immediately once you click the button. So if I go in here, let me just remove all of these things, all of these limitations. So right now we have a diplomatic request that does require acceptance. So if I go here and I click send, what is being executed is the on-sent effect. This section will be executed once I click on send. If the country accepts this diplomatic action, the game will continue and execute the complete effect, right? So for diplomatic actions that require acceptance, on-sent effect is executed first and then complete effect. In diplomatic actions that do not require acceptance, only the complete effect is being executed. Hopefully I got the message across. Now lastly, we have the reject effect. So naturally, it is only valid if the diplomatic action requires acceptance and if the country has rejected the diplomatic action that we have sent, then the reject effect is being executed. And of course, as before, we can do these effects on the target country. For example, I can type add political power 100, and that means that if it's rejected, then the target country will get 100 political power, in this case France. And of course, if I want to give myself political power, then I will just put root add political power 100, and then me, the country that I'm currently playing, will receive 100 political power. Alright, so these are the effects. Hopefully the difference between on-sent effect and complete effect are clear. Now let's move on to the AI section and see what can be done there. In the AI section, we have two things. We have AI desire and AI acceptance. AI desire determines how likely the AI is to use this diplomatic action, right? If you leave it like this, the AI will not use this diplomatic action at all. But if you add a modifier to it and add some kind of a number that's higher than 0, then the AI will use this diplomatic action. And you can actually put all kinds of conditions in here. So just like I did before, I can also put has political power 100. And that means that only if the AI has more than 100 political power, the AI desire will go from 0 to 10 because this modifier has been added. And you can put a bunch of other modifiers and other things in here that will determine how likely the AI is to use this diplomatic action. And you can find these conditions on the HOI4 wiki, which I have a link to in the video description. And if you look there, you can find a whole bunch of conditions that you can put and play around with them and see how they work for you. Next, we have AI acceptance. So this section is only valid if our diplomatic action is an action that requires acceptance, right? If it's not, then you can completely remove this section like this. You don't really need it. But if it is, then you can, again, put all kinds of modifiers here that will make the AI accept or reject this diplomatic action. So right now we have a factor here that gives 10 points to the AI to accept this diplomatic action. And if I look here, you see that they will accept. But if I were to change this to -10 and click again, you see that now they are rejecting this diplomatic action. So again, you can play around with it and see how things work out when you try all kinds of conditions with the AI acceptance. Now, please note that unlike with the AI desire, every modifier that you put needs to have its own name, because if we take a look here, you see that it says base desire, just like here, right? This is in place to allow the player to see why the AI might accept or reject their offer. Now, these have their own localization keys, which we will take a look at once we move on to localization and to localizing our diplomatic action. All right, so these are the basic things that you need to know about diplomatic actions. I highly encourage you to play around with it, try different things, see how things work, disable the acceptance, see how that works, do all of these things, and the more you play around with these things, the better you will understand them. All right, now let's move on to localizing our diplomatic action. All right, now we'll be talking about creating DA localization, creating diplomatic action localization. Now, in most cases in HOI4, localization is a pretty straightforward thing. And if you watch some of my previous lessons, you'll see that it's in most cases a no-brainer. But in diplomatic actions, it can be a little bit more complex. So let's go ahead and see how we can do this properly for the diplomatic actions. In your DATF folder, you will find the localization folder. And inside of it, you will find this file, custom diplomatic actions L English. Let's go ahead and open it. And in here, you will see these entries. And some of these may look a little bit strange. First of all, why are they all in caps? When you put all the text in caps, it's easier for modders to know that this entry is a localization key. So localization keys are what tells the game where to look for the localization for a specific thing. So for example, if we go back to our test diplomatic action, you see that here it says send description, test diplo action lock. And it tells the game to go over here to this file, find this, and put this in the localization, right? So that is the localization key. And it stands out from the rest of the code because it's in caps. And this way I know that this is not some kind of a code that determines behavior of this diplomatic action, but it's just a localization key and that I need to open a localization file in order to change it. Now let me just split this file in two so that we can take a closer look at it. You might notice that for some reason, if I take a look here, it says test diplomatic action. It's not in caps, but here it says test diplomatic action title and it's all in caps. Now, I'm not sure why this is the case, and it took me quite a while to figure this out. But for some reason, the localization entries for the diplomatic actions, at least for their name and description, they have to be in caps. Otherwise, the game does not see them. It is possible that it may have been solved in the last patch. I really don't know. I haven't tested it, nor did I have the time to test it. But in my experience before that, that was the case. And if you do not put it in caps, it did not see the localization for your diplomatic action. So as a safety precaution, I always put them in caps. And you will see that alongside the ID of the diplomatic action, I also put title, right? So action title. So it goes like this: test diplomatic action title. And that tells the game that this localization key is the title of your diplomatic action. Then we have test diplomatic action description. And this tells the game that this is the description of your diplomatic action. Now you see here that I have the word action twice. And that is because I named my diplomatic action with action at the end. But on top of that, the game requires you to have action description in order for this to work. You must follow this syntax in order for it to work, otherwise it will not show up correctly. So the first one takes care of the title, right? So it says test, and this is what we see here. Next we have the action description, and this is what you see when you hover your mouse over the diplomatic action, like so. Next we have test diplo action lock, and that is what I set in here. So the first two do not have their separate entry in here, and it starts from here with the send description, and this is what we see here when we open this window. Next we have the action receiver, and this is when I click send, the country that gets the diplomatic action will see this localization entry. Next we have the accept title and accept description. So if it's a diplomatic action that requires acceptance, if they accept, I will get a pop-up back telling me that they have accepted, and this is the text that I can put in there. This is the title and this is the description. And we have the same thing for rejections. So if they reject my diplomatic action, this is the title that I will see, and this is the description. And last but not least, we have the localization for the AI acceptance. As I said before, each of these modifiers needs to have its own name, and the localization can be in the same file. And once you put it in here and you hover your mouse over the accept or not accept icon, you will see the localization in this tooltip. Alright, so that is all you need to know about localizing these diplomatic actions. Now, obviously, if your diplomatic action does not require acceptance, both the accept and reject sections are not relevant. Alright, now let's move on to creating our diplomatic action icon. So here at the beginning of the test diplomatic action, you have the icon definition, and right after it you see a number. So this is the number of the icon that will be used for this diplomatic action. And this icon is only visible when the action requires acceptance. So the country that is receiving the diplomatic action, it will have the icon showing at the top, and then they can click the icon and accept or reject it. So let's go ahead and figure out what this number means. If you open your IW Diplo request folder, you'll see that we have a folder called GFX. So let's open that, interface, alert, and in here you have this file. Let's go ahead and open this file in paint.net. And let's zoom in on it a little bit more. Now in this file we have 16 icons, but I edited this file and put another icon that you can use. So if you go to the last one, number 16, you can just put anything above this icon to use as your diplomatic action icon. Now I won't be editing this icon right now. You can draw over it, do whatever you want in order for you to recognize it, and then go ahead and save it by going to File, Save, making sure that in Settings you select this setting, clicking OK, saving the file, and then your icon is ready. And because it is icon number 16, that is why you have the number 16. If you want to use icon number 15, you just change this to 15, and then the game will use icon number 15. And it looks at these icons from left to right. So this is icon number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Another thing that you have to do in order to use these icons, you will need to edit an interface file. Now, I intentionally did not edit the file because I wanted you to do it, because if you are creating another diplomatic action with another icon, you need to know how to do this. So let's go ahead into our folder, go to interface, and open the alerts.gfx file. And in here, we need to find the file of the icons for the diplomatic actions. Now, you can either scroll this file and look around for it, or you can just go back to the folder, go to the GFX folder, copy the name of the file, hit Ctrl+F, find next, and then it will find the file for you. Here it is, and in here you see that it says number of frames 15. So this is the number of icons that are in this file. And it's important to let the game know how many icons there are, because if this number is not consistent with the graphic file, then it will not work properly. So I'm going to change it to 16 and save the file. One last thing that I want to mention, which is very important, is how you can actually test these diplomatic actions to see all the changes. Because, for example, if I'm sending this diplomatic action to France, I need to know what France sees and how they interpret my diplomatic request. So you can do this by starting the game in debug mode, opening the console, and then you can change the country that you're currently playing. So if I want to switch to France, I will type tag, T-A-G, FRA, F-R-A, right? So that is the tag of France. And I can know this by clicking Control and Alt on my keyboard and seeing that, for example, one of these provinces of France belongs to F-R-A. And for example, here it's ITA, Italy. So I can switch that. And without unpausing the game, it's very important that you don't unpause the game. I'm going to switch to France. And then we can see here that they get this notification about the diplomatic request that I sent. So I can click that and I can either decline or accept, and obviously see if the effects have been applied to the country like they are supposed to. Alright, so this is all the basic stuff that you need to know about creating diplomatic actions. These diplomatic actions can actually be very complex and very interesting to integrate into the game, but I highly suggest that you start slow and test little changes before you move on to trying big ones, because it's very important that you get comfortable with how these diplomatic actions work before you attempt to do anything complex. For those of you who are sticking around, I'm going to talk a bit about how to prevent AI spamming you with diplomatic requests in the additional syntax section. For those of you who are not sticking around, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Alright, we've reached the additional diplomatic action syntax section. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to give you a small tip on how to prevent the AI from spamming you with diplomatic actions. That is something that can occur as well as other diplomatic actions that are done in the vanilla game. I assume you've experienced the flood of non-aggression pact requests that Paradox games have, so we're going to try to minimize that. So let's open our file, and in here I'm going to go to the onSent effect, and I'm going to type the following: root set country flag This is going to be a double bracket, right? So I need two closing brackets. Flag, diplomatic action cooldown, value 1, days 30. And in here, in the AI desire, I'm going to put another modifier, root has country flag, and I'm going to give it a -100 to AI desire. So what happens here? The root country, the country that initiates the diplomatic request, gets a country flag. If you don't know what a country flag is, I've talked about them a little bit in the basic syntax lesson, so you might want to go ahead and look at that. Very basically, flags are these little things that you can put in countries to mark them with certain things, but they're very flexible, so they can be used for things like that. So we're putting a country flag on the country that did the diplomatic action for 30 days, and it counts down, and every day it lowers the amount of days, and when it reaches 0, the country flag is removed. And here in the AI desire, I'm telling the AI that if the root country has this flag, then it does not want to use this diplomatic action. And that reduces the spam of these diplomatic requests for 30 days. Obviously, if other conditions are still valid, then after 30 days, they will send it again. Alright, so this is all there is to diplomatic actions. This is a very complicated lesson. I totally understand if you are a little bit confused or if things didn't work out. Please let me know in the comments if something isn't working or if you have other questions, and I will do my best to answer them. Thank you very much for being with me, and I will see you on the next lesson, tutorial, and video on the Iron Workshop. Bye bye. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, give it a like. The algorithm and me will be very happy. Here are more videos I make. If you like my stuff, consider subscribing to be notified when new content is available. The Iron Workshop lives and thrives thanks to the continued support of my Patreons. If you're willing and able, you can support me on Patreon for just $1 and get access to exclusive and early content. See you around.